Daniel Riedel, CEO of New Context, a technology and product development firm focusing on securing critical infrastructure. New Context has been working with Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, and both the Idaho and Lawrence Livermore National Labs to assist cybersecurity research for the energy industry. Thank you very much for coming.
First off, honored to be here, humbled by the intelligence and the folks that who have been speaking here earlier, and also thank you Lexington Institute for having me. We've talked a lot about OT, and what I want to do on the 3 points that I want to talk about today, which is technology, a little bit of policy, and then briefly on the challenges that we're also we haven't quite brought together yet, which is in the OT environment. We have been working on this for a long time. Utilities have somewhat of a grasp around this, and we're looking at a situation where we have around 56,000 substations plus several hundred points of generation. And where we're going quite rapidly, especially in California, as we said that we are going to put solar panels on every single new house that goes out there, we're now looking at millions of points of generation. And that millions of points of generation also means additional third parties that are going to be involved in this, startups that are also going to be involved in this, and basically an entire supply chain of both information and technology. That means that we have to look at protecting that. And so, you know, as we look at where we are going with DERMS, this is what I'm sort of talking about, distributed energy resources, we need to look at the fact that these environments are also going to be working outside of the world of NERC, outside of the world of FERC. And they're possibly going to be operating on home networks. They're possibly going to be operating on business networks. And so we've done a very good job of securing our infrastructure by making sure we've isolated these networks and built technology around. In fact, many of these utilities, as we know, almost have networks as robust as telcos. And so we need to think about how are we going to look at securing that as well. And the other key component of that, in my mind, also is the humans that are involved. And we can't forget about this. And so we have additional endpoints. We have third parties that are growing. We have a world where we're going from isolated networks to untrusted networks. And then we have humans that are now making decisions on the bulk power grid with information that's coming off of the power grid that is not necessarily on the same regulatory requirements as the world that they are, and then making decisions between those two. And we have to think a lot about that. And so as we've talked about OT earlier today, I just want to kind of remind ourselves that this is quickly approaching. I think in California, as I said, we have several million of these endpoints, and we're actually distributing them throughout the rest of the United States. And so I want to just kind of briefly talk about policy for a second when it comes to what we approached when we dealt with the AMI network. And the AMI and smart grid network that was out there, when that was first proposed a decade ago, I was in conversations with my friends in INL, and they reminded me we didn't necessarily have a strategy, a cybersecurity strategy for that network. And to probably a lot of work with folks in this room and others, they actually did eventually create a broader sort of a regulatory framework for the AMI smart grid network. And I'm hoping that we also take a look at that for this DERM environment that's coming forward towards us very rapidly. And so, the key point that New Context is excited about, and what I'm excited about, excite shouldn't be the best word, I apologize there. What we're actually focusing on is understanding how we can orchestrate and automate our responses to an environment when we are adding so much complexity that humans are going to have a challenge in dealing. And so the key points of technology that we've been thinking about. And as we talk with our associates at the utilities and the associated Department of Energy, we sort of, in our minds, have kind of broken that down into sort of 5 critical areas. And those areas in our minds are identity, trusted data, isolated networks, intelligence, and orchestration. Now, we earlier heard about credentials and the fact that they can be stolen and they can be used maliciously. And we are actually at a point in time where we've made a lot of advancement on those credentials. And so as we roll out these new technologies such as Douris and even look at the OT environment that we have, which is, someone was talking about Modbus not having a lot of authentication, we have an opportunity to increase the resilience of that environment. And so we've already seen it with our phones, with biometrics, with multi-factor identification. So I think that we really need to take a strong look on how we actually deal with identity when it comes to who's operating these systems, who's installing these systems, who's writing software these systems, and making sure that that's involved in creating these a more rigorous environment around that. The other thing that we've looked at is trusted data. I'm not going to use the buzzword. I'm just going to say distributed cryptographic ledgers for now. And it's actually a relatively simple construct that if we have third parties, then we need to figure out how each of those organizations can share information and have some level of trust of where that data came from, hasn't been manipulated. And this is one of the technologies that does that. Additionally, there's 2 key areas I want to talk about using that. One's the supply chain. So we have software and hardware and how that moves forward. And then we have also just the supply chain of devices so that we're actually making decisions on data properly between the bulk grid and the non-bulk grid. And we have some level of trust that the device that got here has not been altered in the process of it actually getting to the utility or to the house where it's actually installed. Isolated networks is the other item that we've looked at, and whether it's solar, whether it's a battery, whether it's the car battery that's operating, we talked about Tesla, offloading power into cars. We need to figure out whether the home network or the business network is the best way for these things to communicate, where we have zero visibility, or an adversary can sit there and poke against a device for a long period of time and see, add to the additional vulnerabilities. And so, again, like biometrics, we're at a very exciting moment in time where we have 5G rolling out, there's software-defined networking. We have the technologies to actually build, smarter isolated networks, and so we should really do that. We've found this success in the OT environment. We try and keep the OT environment separated from that IT environment, and so as we distribute all these industrial IoT devices around, we should possibly learn from that same thing. Intelligence. Intelligence, we talked about it earlier, the concept of sharing. Part of the research that we worked on with the state of California and the Department of Energy was building a language on how do we actually share information from multiple machines. And what we ended up doing is working with Styx. Styx is a relatively popular information sharing technology. We also, for the folks that were talking about behavior, built in Styx patterning into that. So we can actually describe a behavior and share that behavior as opposed to just a malware hash or an IP address. And so, we have to figure out with all these additional third parties where beforehand we may have had a little easier time. Well, not easier, 3,000 utilities and sharing data between them is actually a little bit of a challenge. But now we're going to add thousands of other organizations as well, and we need to figure out how do these folks share information, because when an adversary is able to attack one small organization, how does another small organization know what that attack is, and how do they share that information? And so we really need to kind of focus on that. And then orchestration, which is we have all of these devices out there. We have a complex environment, and yes, we definitely need to hire and train cybersecurity professionals, but at some moment in time, we have a math problem. And that math problem is that we just simply can't hire enough. And so, though it scares the OT operator, and we have to work very closely with the OT operator, we are going to have to look at what we can do from an automated defense perspective. And so orchestration and automation is something our company is looking at building software for. I think it is definitely more the advanced stage of where we are going from a technology perspective, but we absolutely have to take a look at it. And so again, I think it's identity, it's trusted data, it's isolated networks, it's intelligence, and it's orchestration that will help build a better grid from our perspective. And again, it was thank you very much for having us, or having me, sorry, one person, and okay, bye.